That sounded successful, didn't it? Right. This is the first talk of the afternoon. My name's Mike. I'm a volunteer with the Spiritual Crisis Network. I've been volunteering with them for about 8 years now. And one of the things I do is reply to emails sent into the Spiritual Crisis Network. And I also help co-facilitate the SCN peer support group up in Sheffield. What I'm also doing is PhD research into effective interventions for spiritual crisis, or in other words, what helps people who are going through a spiritual crisis. And one of the things we heard this morning was that there's a real need for change, especially in mainstream mental health services. So it's research like this and the other speakers that you're going to hear from this afternoon, which are going to try and provide the evidence for making that change happen. So without further ado, I'll just say I'm a PhD student at Canterbury Christ Church University, supported by the Professional Development Foundation and Alef Trust. And my supervisors for the PhD are Professor Les Lancaster, Dr. David Lukoff, and Professor David Lane. So, an overview of this talk this afternoon. I'm going to talk very briefly about what is spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency. I tend to use those two terms interchangeably. Probably most of you won't need much of a description of that, but I'll just do it in case there's anyone here who isn't that familiar with the definition. I'll talk a little bit about what the Spiritual Crisis Network actually does. I'll say very briefly what methodology I used. And the really interesting bit is I'll give you a summary of my research results. What I undertook was an evaluation of the work of the Spiritual Crisis Network. So I wanted to see how effective it was at what it actually does. So part one, what is spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency? So this is my very bare bones definition. This is what I was interested in when I started my research. Any spiritual or anomalous experience that causes concern or distress to the person who experiences it or for those around them. Now, there's three key points to this very brief definition. Firstly, I was interested in any spiritual or anomalous, that is unusual experience. So that could be a mystical experience, a psychic opening, a Kundalini awakening, a paranormal experience, a peak experience, you name it. If that person considered it to be a spiritual experience, that's what I'm interested in. That's the first point. The second point about this is that I'm interested in those kinds of spiritual experience that cause concern or distress. Now, the concern could just be very mild. It may not be particularly acute, but it could range through to some really acute distress, even a full-blown crisis. So there's a range in the concern or distress that it can cause. The third point here is that I'm not just interested in the person who has the experience, I'm also interested in the people around them, in particular how they respond to that person, which, as you'll see, is very important later. Now, I know this is a very simple definition of spiritual crisis, so let's have a look at one that's a bit more detailed. I won't read through this whole slide, but it's important to point out some of the main features of a spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis. They can be spontaneous and involuntary, but they're considered to be a natural process. The person experiencing it is often overwhelmed by spiritual energies or experiences altered states of consciousness, including also turbulent emotions, perceptions, sensations, and thoughts. And for that reason, spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency is often confused or overlaps with mental health issues. There are often spiritual themes or mythical themes to what's experienced, and it's difficult to integrate and can result in changes to beliefs and behaviors. It can result in a breakdown of ego, an expanded sense of self. But if managed correctly, then it can result in development or profound personal transformation. The term spiritual emergency was coined by Stanislav and Christina Grof back in the early 80s, and as you may know, they came up with 10 varieties of spiritual emergency. I've not got time to go through them all here, and you're probably familiar with most of them anyway, but they include things like Kundalini awakening, near-death experiences, past life memories, possession states, entity attachment, and so on. So that was a very brief overview of what I'm talking about, what I mean by spiritual crisis. So what does the Spiritual Crisis Network do? Well, the network was founded in about 2004. It became a limited company in 2008, a not-for-profit company, and it went online in 2011. It's staffed entirely by volunteers, a small team of volunteers comprised of experiencers, therapists, and trainee therapists. And the SCN maintains an agnostic or open-minded approach to spiritual crisis. It's not trying to convert anyone to a particular view or model or explanation for spiritual crisis. And as you heard this morning, it's not an anti-psychiatry organisation, although obviously a lot of people who contact the spiritual crisis are unhappy with the way they were treated in mainstream mental health. So the Spiritual Crisis Network provides a number of services. We provide support via email to people who contact us about their spiritual crisis. We have a website with other information, such as grounding on there. We operate several peer support groups in the UK and online. We hold occasional training and awareness events. The next ones are actually in April, so have a look on the events page of the SCN website if you're interested in training and awareness events. We occasionally organise academic conferences, much like this one today. It's quite a while, it's a few years since we had the last one. And we also operate an online discussion forum, which people can join and share their experiences. So just to give you an idea of numbers, these are the figures for 2020. I've not yet had time to compile the figures for 2021, but in 2020, the SCN was contacted by 258 people. 128 of these were asking for support for their own spiritual crisis, and about 27 were asking on behalf of someone else, someone they were supporting or caring for. Those may not seem like huge numbers, but actually the number of volunteers is about maybe a dozen or so, I think, active volunteers at any one time. So this is quite a large number of people to respond to. And in 2020, the SCN received 58 thank you messages and thankfully no complaints. This next chart shows the numbers of contacts that we've been getting at the SCN from 2011 up to 2020. Again, I've not had time to add 2021 to this yet, so I suspect it's gone up even further. And as you can see, there's an increasing trend. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the incidence of spiritual crisis is increasing in society, although it could be. But this certainly means that the SCN is becoming better known. And for example, in 2015, I'm pretty sure that's when we had our Norfolk conference, and people obviously got in touch with us at that point. So I just want to give a few examples. These are used with permission from the people that took part in my research. And the emails that come into the SCN are usually pretty brief and to the point. They don't provide detailed information about what people are experiencing, because people are asking first and foremost for help. So just to give you a flavour of what kind of emails we get, one person wrote into us and said, "I've recently had what I would call a spiritual emergence or crisis. My doctor has not been much help, so I'm looking for help and advice as to what I should do next, and indeed to know what actually happens to me." Another person wrote in and said, "I'm currently going through a period of identity dismantling, spiritual crisis, deep personal transformation. I need support with this. I'm finding this period quite challenging." And a third example, someone else wrote to us and said, "I have a friend who's having a difficult time. She is not in crisis, but I'm concerned that she may be soon. I had a crisis myself about 8 years ago and found the support of a local group invaluable. I'm trying to organise some support in case my friend has a crisis." So of course, the SCN gets contacted by people who are caring for others and supporting others as well, including some therapists. So that was what the SCN does in a nutshell. I want to say a little bit now about my research methodology that I used for the first study in my PhD. I'll keep this fairly brief. As with most research, I started with a literature review, and I was looking at the empirical evidence base for effective interventions for spiritual crisis, or in other words, what helps people when they're going through a spiritual emergency. During doing that, I came across, well, I identified five main themes. The first one of those was the alternative approaches taken to psychosis and schizophrenia in the late 70s, early 80s by organisations such as Soteria, which used non-medical staff in residential houses away from hospitals and minimal use of medication to try and help people work through their crisis in a supported way. The second theme of evidence for supporting people going through crises is positive appraisals, and there's some research done on this which clearly shows that the effect an appraisal of an experience can have makes a difference. So how the experiencer or people around them respond to that experience makes a difference to the outcome of that experience. If people respond in a negative way, then the outcomes tend to be worse, and if people respond in a more positive, supportive way, then the outcomes tend to be better. The third theme is the importance, as we've heard this morning, of frameworks and narratives. So many people who experience a spiritual crisis, it will be out of the blue, it'll be spontaneous, and they won't know what to make of it. They won't have a framework or a reference point for it. So the importance of having that narrative, that framework, is clearly demonstrated. And there are many narratives and frameworks that are relevant, from spirituality, from religion, from psychology, from mythology, and so on. For example, the hero's journey from mythology, or the chakra system if it's a Kundalini awakening system experience, and so on. There are lots and lots of different frameworks out there. The fourth main theme from the literature review about what was helpful were self-help practices, attitudes, and behaviours. And we're going to hear later on from Marie Brooke about her research into this area. It's probably one of the least researched areas. But there are lots of things that do help, and we've heard about them this morning already, often referred to as grounding practices, like spending time in nature, eating the right foods, getting plenty of sleep, maintaining social contacts, and so on. And finally, the fifth theme, really just represented by one paper. This was quite important, quite interesting. It suggested that there are two pathways to managing successfully a spiritual crisis: a suppressive pathway, which is more about grounding and getting the experience under control when it's in its acute stage, and the second pathway was a facilitative pathway, which is about finding meaning in the experience, finding out the significance of the experience for the person who's experiencing it. And those two pathways tend to be complementary. So that's what I identified in the literature review. So my objective in my research was to evaluate the spiritual crisis network by gathering experiencer feedback on the services provided by the SCN. The first question was, did people find contacting the SCN helpful or unhelpful? The second question was, why was contacting the SCN helpful or unhelpful? And thirdly, how did the SCN compare to mental health organisations? The research design, I used an online survey. I contacted everyone who had been in touch with the Spiritual Crisis Network since it went online in 2011, and asked them, or invited them, to complete that survey. It included questions that allowed them to rate the SCN and rate different SCN services. And it also included open-ended questions where people could tell me in more detail about their experiences and what they thought, which I then subjected to a thematic analysis. I won't talk through all the ethics, but the research was done with approval from the Ethics Board at the Professional Development Foundation and Canterbury Christ Church University. So let's get to the interesting bit. What did we actually find? So a summary of my research results, and there was so much detail, it was overwhelming. So this can only ever be a brief summary. But here's some demographics to get started. So I invited 1,605 people who had contacted the SCN since 2011 to complete the survey. 107 responded. That might seem like a small number, but actually that's quite an acceptable number for a survey response. Surveys do not tend to get a large number of responses. The majority of those people were female, 61%, 36 identified as male, 3% preferred not to say. The majority were non-religious, did not identify with any particular religion. The second biggest majority identified as some variety of Christian, and there were a lot of other in there as well. So this category of spiritual but not religious, or pagan, or some other kind of identification. A large majority of people had either a degree or a postgraduate qualification, and the majority were also white British. The age of the crisis, where their crisis began, was generally between either 25 to 34 years of age or 35 to 40 years old, although there were some either side of that. So what about the experiences themselves? What did the survey results say about that? Well, I asked people lots of questions about this, and one of the questions was, did they find that their experience caused them great distress? And 74% said that yes, their experience caused some or great distress for themselves. 72% of people said that their experience caused some or great distress for the people around them. 75% felt that they had now integrated their spiritual crisis, and 75% also said that their spiritual crisis was a positive transformational experience for them. So in each case here, there is roughly a quarter of people that don't agree with those, which is interesting, but the majority are saying that they have integrated their crisis and that it was a positive transformational experience for them, even though it caused them great distress, similar to what Steve Taylor was saying this morning. Not sure how well you can see that on screen, but these are the types of varieties of spiritual emergency that people reported from the survey. I added a few that the graphs didn't mention, but that other researchers since then have also spoken about. I think the majority seem to come in as episodes of unitive consciousness and mystical experiences. Those are the ones that people reported most often. Also high on there were energetic experiences within the body, and Kundalini awakening and awakening of extrasensory perception or psychic opening were also reported quite frequently. There were a few experiences that were infrequent, surprisingly. Hallucinogenic or psychedelic drug experiences were only 2%. Experience of close encounters with UFOs was only 1%. And I think near-death experiences, yeah, that was only 2% as well. But again, that doesn't necessarily reflect the incidence of these experiences in society. It could be, for example, that people who experience near-death experiences go to a different organisation to talk about their experiences rather than the Spiritual Crisis Network. So what else did they say? 37% of survey participants reported that they had received a mental health diagnosis during their crisis. So it's important to note actually that the majority of people didn't say that they had received a mental health diagnosis at all. And of course, you don't necessarily have to receive a mental health diagnosis. Some people manage to get through their crisis without doing so, without contacting the mental health services at all. Of those that did get a diagnosis, the most common ones are the ones in bigger writing on that little graphic there. So psychotic disorder, anxiety disorders, and depression were the most frequently mentioned mental health diagnosis. So question one, was the SCN actually helpful? 64% said that contacting the SCN was either moderately or very helpful, and only 10% rated the SCN as moderately or very unhelpful. 63% said they were satisfied or very satisfied with the support they received from the SCN, and 13% indicated they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. 76% were likely or very likely to recommend the SCN to someone else, and 51% were interested in volunteering with the SCN. I will comment on, make some conclusions to all of this at the end. Second question, so what was helpful? In this, there are four main themes that I identified from the qualitative data. There are numerous different benefits of contacting the SCN, including things like getting access to information and so on. The second theme was that they got a new perspective on what they were experiencing from the SCN, that framework that I mentioned earlier. The third theme was how it made people felt once they had contacted the SCN. And the fourth theme I identified was the qualities of the SCN volunteers themselves. Now, due to time, I'm only going to talk about two of these themes, how people felt and qualities of the SCN volunteers.
That's 20 minutes, Mike.
Thanks, Alan. Almost there. So how people felt after they'd contacted the SCN. The majority of people, nearly everybody, said that contacting the SCN had made them feel less alone. So, for example, it felt extremely personal, empathetic, and helped me feel less alone and more grounded. Another example, many thanks for taking the time to contact me. It has helped me to feel not as alone. Another thing that people felt was comforted by contacting the SCN. I won't read out all the examples, but I'll let you read them on screen if you like to. People also felt that they'd been understood when they contacted volunteers at the SCN. They felt they'd been supported and taken seriously. And they felt that they'd received hope. They were given hope in their situation. So why did they feel this way? Well, it seems that the SCN volunteers have a really important role to play in this. And I think it's the qualities and behaviours and attitudes of the SCN volunteers which helped people to feel that way. So, for example, the SCN volunteers were experienced as being very welcoming. Any topic around spiritual crisis and mental health was welcomed. Personal experiences were welcomed. The wisdom of the members was welcomed. It was a very welcoming environment. The volunteers were found to be understanding and empathic people. They were also said to be good at listening, sort of deep listening. Again, someone mentioned it this morning, this importance of actually person-centered listening to people rather than just prescribing medication or something like that. And this sense of being understood, they felt they'd been understood by engaging with the volunteers in peer support groups or by email. So, for example, the only place I feel that had any close understanding of who and why was happening to me was a person that replied to my cry for help. This person I found at Spiritual Crisis Network. The only place that warmed my heart with understanding was the Spiritual Crisis Network. The volunteers are also non-judgmental. They took my confused thoughts without judgment and gave them back to me in a way that made more sense. And compassionate. Thank you so much for your reply. It was lovely to receive such compassion and support from a stranger. I'm glad to say I'm coping far, far better now. So question 4, actually I think it was question 3, but a comparison of Spiritual Crisis Network and mental health services. So 70% of respondents said that they contacted a mainstream mental health service during their crisis. 47% said that they found the mental health service was helpful, whilst 40% said that the mental health service was unhelpful. On the other hand, 18% said they found their diagnosis helpful, and 49% said that they found their diagnosis was unhelpful. So the comparison, 80% said contacting the SCN was slightly or much more helpful than contacting mental health services. And 11% on the contrary said contacting the SCN was slightly or much less helpful. So some brief summaries and conclusions here. The first one is that the majority of people did rate the SCN as helpful to a greater or lesser degree, but it's actually clear that not everybody found it helpful for whatever reason. So this approach is not necessarily effective for everybody. What's also clear is that whilst practices, attitudes and behaviours are indeed very helpful, what appears to be really important is how people respond. The people in the survey didn't tend to give me lists or examples of practices and attitudes and behaviours that helped. What they tended to do was talk about how they felt and how the volunteers had made them feel when they got contacted. So the importance of volunteer qualities, attitudes and behaviours is a key thing to what the SCN does. And based on the comparison between the SCN and contacting mainstream mental health services, I would say that this is a complementary approach rather than an alternative approach to mental health. We're going to need both to some extent to help support people going through a crisis. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, I'll happily try and answer them.